evening or good morning, depending on which part of the world you're on. My name is Andrew Murtha. I'm the Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs and the George and Saney Hyman Professor of China Studies here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. It is my genuine pleasure to be able to piggyback on the National Committee on U.S. China Relations China Town Hall, and to be able to introduce today's speaker and commentator on Ray Dalio's wonderful presentation, Dr. John Lipsky, who is the Peter G. Peterson Distinguished Scholar at the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs here at SAIS. Just a little bit of background on on Dr. Lipsky. He is also the co-chair of the Aspen Institute's program on the world economy. He chairs the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he is the vice chair of the Center for Global Development and an executive committee member of the Bretton Woods Committee. Dr. Lipsky is formerly the first deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and he also has held senior positions at the JPMorgan Investment Bank, JPMorgan Chase, Chase Manhattan Bank, and Salomon Brothers. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure and delight to hand the baton over and the microphone over to my friend and colleague, John Lipsky.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew, for that very generous introduction. I think the conclusion that you can reach from that is that I've been around for quite a while, which is true. Now, I'm assuming that all our town hall participants were listening to Ray Dalio's presentation, but I will go through what struck me as some salient points on in his presentation on his view of China, and especially from the point of view of a major international investor with, as he described, a very long, I think he said 36-year history in with Chinese markets, Chinese economy, Chinese officials, etc., and which makes him a real veteran, I think, of the let's call it the Wall Street community of large-scale, important international investors based here in the U.S. I found his presentation particularly interesting in the following way. It was very big picture. And some of the things that he talked about, I thought were very, very interesting because in a way he skated over some issues that today's economists looking at the short term in China see as real challenges. So I found that extremely interesting that he's really looking, implicitly at least, looking over what Chinese experts on the Chinese economy would say are serious near-term challenges if China is going to continue to demonstrate the kind of eye-popping progress that they have had in for the past decades. So let me just run over briefly what struck me from what Ray Dalio said. He wonders he pointed out that from his, I guess, his array of greatness indicators, power indicators, I think he called it. I'm anxious for his book to come out. I have not seen an advanced copy, but he promises that this analysis is in the book. He says that basically China is already essentially at top rank in his power ratings with the two obvious shortcomings. One, it's not a financial center and their currency is not a reserve currency. In that regard, he says, or his view is, that right now foreign investors have their portfolio allocations, about 1% to 2% of their allocations are toward Chinese securities. And of course, that's somewhat complicated, as he implied, and as many of you know well. that's not quite as simple as going simply to the PRC itself and buying a Chinese currency or a security, but many of those are owned in offshore forms, for example, through Hong Kong. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this. But the main point he was making is today that weighting is about 1 to 2% of portfolios, and it ought to be, if things were just neutrally weighted, about 15%. And if China continues to advance in both economic weight and the opening of their financial markets, that 15% ought to grow. So to him, I'd say that's the biggest bet, that investors, even in today's, using today's criteria, ought to own a lot more in Chinese securities. But he also says that they're going to be opening up their financial markets, and that's quite true. And it strikes me also that this is he didn't explain it at much length, but in fact, in the past few years, a couple of years, the Chinese authorities have begun granting securities licenses to foreign firms to operate in domestic Chinese securities markets without having to have a majority local partner. In other words, they are opening up. And as he says, that opening up is going to produce not just inflows of capital, but inflows of knowledge along with that capital. And that inevitably is going to help propel Chinese economy forward and provide, I assume, he didn't quite say so, but I assume handsome returns, i.e. relatively good returns that are good relative to alternatives. There was a discussion about whether the RMB will or become a reserve currency, but it didn't strike me that he thought that was a near-term issue, that it wasn't the requirement for him to continue to increase his investments in Chinese markets. There was discussion about convertibility, and this is, to be a bit jocular, the old Wall Street definition of an emerging market is a market from which it's difficult to emerge in an emergency. And that's inconvertibility. In other words, that just when you want to take your money out, that's when you're either not allowed or the markets are too thin and you can't get out. And Mr. Dalio, Ray Dalio, was saying, it's not really, there's convertibility and convertibility, and it hasn't been a problem for him so far. Of course, again, an issue that he sort of didn't deal with directly, but is an obvious one, of course, because right now, foreign investors are a very small percentage of Chinese capital markets. So one way or another doesn't make that much of a difference, even though there are substantial controls on Chinese investors wishing to invest in foreign securities. So basically, for Ray Dalio right now, it's a non-issue. It could become an issue going forward, but he's confident that it will remain on the sidelines. And he noted something that I myself have noted for years. If you talk to your counterparts in China, the public officials dealing with the financial sector, with the central bankers, they are extremely capable, knowledgeable, and sophisticated in their views. And you always had the sense that if it were up to them, they would make substantial liberalizations in domestic markets and in opening to the outside. So it always has seemed that the rhythm is going of internationalization of the Chinese currency and markets is ultimately been a political factor. But even there, Ray Dalio didn't seem too concerned, as he said, well, we can't expect the same standards, even in the long term, implicitly, in China, and that's okay. Other factors that I hope you noticed and I thought were interesting, his basically tossing aside of the issue of digital currency, and in ways that I happen to agree with. public authorities around the world are not going to allow private currencies to operate internationally outside of regulatory control if they can help it. And so what you're really talking about digital currencies is, on the one hand, just ways to make the financial system work better and more cheaply. But in the Chinese case, as he said, there are, you could call them digital currency, but digital institutions that are outside the formal regulatory system, like Ant Financial. And as he said, just you watch, they're going to become much more regulated. I could go on, but I think those were some salient points. He talked about the issues like technological decoupling, or you could say Chinese drive for technical self-sufficiency on the one side, and on the US side, and perhaps Western side now, with things like Huawei and 5G, a potential technical decoupling that will limit or reduce or limit the interoperability of the internet across borders into China, something that already exists, but have that become even more profound with basically two different technical standards operating. He doesn't seem to have been much bothered by that, but I think that at the same time, he said we should be looking for opportunities for cooperation with China, something that's for sure something we all would like. But of course, he didn't really address that on the near term on issues like technology. Both sides seem to be looking for avenues of reduced cooperation, not the other way around. At any rate, it was very interesting set of presentation, interesting presentation, and interesting to see Ray Dalio's confidence that as an investor, we can just look at the very big aspects and be confident that it's all going to work. But I thought, I don't want to take too long so we can get to a discussion, but there's some factors about the Chinese economy that were some of the questioners alluded to that Ray Dalio essentially didn't deal with in any detail or pushed aside, I'd say, as not necessarily influencing much his positive view of investment. And that is that some salient forces and factors in the Chinese economy really seem to have changed after the global financial crisis in 2007, 8, 9, in which, as we all know, the Chinese economy bounced back quickly, just as it seems to be doing today in the wake of the COVID pandemic, something I'll come back to in a minute. And that is that one longer term factor that has become more relevant post global financial crisis, but that was evident even before, and that are the demographics. And those who want to put that in a way, and as a source of concern about Chinese economic outlook, would say the risk is that China's going to grow old before it gets rich. And, or another way of looking at it is labor force growth is going to look more like a developed economy, even though that today per capita income in China, depending on how you measure it, is maybe a fifth or a quarter of that in the United States. So what that means is to sustain growth, that they need to produce much faster productivity growth because the labor force is not going to be growing. And in the same way that we're facing in our future, that the percentage of the economically active population is going to be shrinking relative to the total population. So if we're going to produce increases in per capita income, those who are working are going to have to be that much more productive than in the past. So that's in a, say that's in the background for China that is now becoming much more relevant. Another is that up until the financial crisis, China GDP, the percentage of Chinese GDP represented by external trade was substantial and hit an all-time high. In fact, in 2006, about 60% of GDP. But now the latest figures, it's about 35%, which is to say that in order to sustain growth, since that's not likely to be turning around, that to sustain rapid growth is going to require growth in domestic demand. Hence you've heard the Chinese focus on dual circulation model of economic development, which says basically we can't rely on external demand to carry us forward as in the past, and we have to more and more rely on domestic demand. Big picture, what that says is, what I've already said, is growth in domestic productivity is going to be crucial. And what has been happening post the global financial crisis is productivity growth in China has been slowing. And what China has been doing to counteract that is by increasing the use of credit mechanisms, public spending and public encouraged credit growth to push growth. But the problem has been that one of the means, as perhaps you all know, one of the means of doing that has been to push growth through the banking system, the state-owned enterprises. And the state-owned enterprises are not particularly productive. And in fact, the relative productivity of state-owned enterprises to private Chinese enterprises has been falling in the past few years. And hence, unless there's some change, there is going to have to be a problem in producing the kind of sustained growth that the Chinese want and Ray Dalio assumes is going to happen. Moreover, part of the post-global financial crisis reforms has also been, again, I'm not going to go into the details here because I want to keep, this is not a lecture by me, but it's going to turn into a discussion, has been first a huge increase in credit to municipalities, first through the banking system, that has produced ultimately real estate development and infrastructure development. That means, and you may be astonished to find out, parenthetically, if you're interested in any detail, there's a very good paper by the World Bank published in June of this year on this topic that points out that government capital per worker in China, as a result of the recent years' continued huge increase in spending by state-owned enterprises and by municipal and regional governments, especially on infrastructure, means that government capital per worker in China is already at the average of the OECD countries. In other words, there's a lot of the growth has been kind of, let's call it government growth, where government spending is in the national accounts counts as GDP, even if it doesn't increase productivity, and does, in this case, since it's financed by borrowing, going to cause some problems down the road. Hence, you heard Ray Dalio talking about the worries about the U.S. borrowing, although, and worrying that the U.S. isn't going to be able to do it, isn't going to be able to keep it up. Could be, but right now, ironically, today, because interest rates are so low, the percentage of tax revenue required to to service public sector debt in the U.S. has actually been going down, not up. And unless interest rates go up, it's not going to be a problem near term. And this isn't, so far we haven't had the Yogi Berra effect of, treasury bonds are so popular, nobody goes there anymore. Actually, of course the Fed has something to do with it, but private sector investors are willing to acquire treasury securities and other securities at historically low rates. Now, what does that have to do with China? China's debt to GDP ratio is higher than the US. It's the highest in the world. And so the issue of productivity in the medium to long term is absolutely critical. So in fact, the International Monetary Fund's annual, let's call it consultation mission is the Article 4 consultation mission is the jargon. The annual, let's call it the IMF inspectors, were in China and just last week left and had issued, as usual, a press release in which they, on the one hand, posit a very rapid rebound in China's economy next year. In fact, China's dealing with the pandemic in China has been exemplary. And I highly recommend, if you haven't read, there's a American writer named Peter Hessler, who writes for the New Yorker, who's living in Chengdu and has been giving you kind of a worm's eye, man on the street view of what it's been like to go through the pandemic control measures. And it's absolutely astonishing how effective and complete that they have been. So it's not a surprise that they were able to bring it under control. The IMF's latest figures is that the Chinese economy is going to grow by about 1.9% this year, not decline, grow. And that next year, it's going to grow by about little over 8, they say 8.2% next year, in part reflecting the huge drop in the first quarter as they completely shut the economy down, basically. But the issue is going to be for the years beyond. And that's the part that Ray Dalio didn't address in detail. But if you go on the IMF website, imf.org, and look at China, you can read the press release and you can see a list of the reforms that are going to be necessary if China is going to be able to sustain the kind of growth that they desire and that they have been used to. Financial sector reforms, organizational reforms, educational reforms, etc. The future is not assured. It's not baked in the cake. And in other words, as is true for all of us, if we want to stay the same, we're going to all have to change. But again, just repeating, of interest tonight was Ray Dalio's willingness to say, don't tell them, essentially, they'll deal with these problems. We're so underweight China, and China is such a big opportunity for investment. We're going to go there, and a lot of other people are going to go there. Implicit was a notion somehow beyond that maybe we have to avoid the Thucydides trap of conflict. And in that regard, all I can say is I've been astonished, shocked, and disappointed, to put it mildly. During the global financial crisis, I can assure you, at the highest levels, there was a shared sense of danger, a shared sense of recognition of a need to cooperate, and an understanding, a formal understanding that what the Chinese like to call a win-win solution was possible, and economists would call a Pareto superior outcome is possible, in which everybody is better off and nobody is worse off if we act in a coherent and cooperative way. There was no sense at that time of great power conflict. There was no sense at that time, only a few years ago, that somehow it was against our interests for China to be successful. And you didn't have any sense that the Chinese felt that our success was at their expense, or their success was going to, by necessity, be at our expense. In other words, a zero-sum kind of game. And I wonder why, call me naive, but why we can't get back to that kind of a recognition, or at least move in that direction rather than the other. And parenthetically, that's why it's so important to have efforts at mutual understanding and cooperation, like the Hopkins Nanjing Center, operated by Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'll stop there. Andrew, come on in.
Okay, let me, what a great way to end it. Speaking from completely self-interested perspective. John, thank you.
Purely by chance, purely by chance.
Well, thank you very, very much for those stimulating comments. And we're starting to get questions. Before I ask mine, I did not thank everybody at the very beginning, and so I want to make sure I do not lose the opportunity to do so. So I want to thank Sonia Holmes. I want to thank Pedro Matias. I'd like to also thank Gabrielle Rayner, for whom this is her second day on the job, and who's acquitted herself beautifully. And then, of course, Madeline Ross, without whom nothing would happen, or if it did, it wouldn't work. So I just want to thank everybody for all their work. And what I wanted to I also neglected to mention that if you have a question, please post it on the Q&A function, and I will get to them in due course. And if you can, also just tell us who you are, in case I don't recognize you from your name. So, John, I just want to kind of start with where you started, but from maybe a different perspective. Where you ended was this kind of last point or in time where it seemed like a Pareto superior outcome might actually be possible. And I just anecdotally, I remember I was interviewing Chinese officials right around the time of the global financial crisis. And some people might recall that one of the things that the Obama administration was doing was making the stimulus funds available to states, and you had red state governors who refused to take that stimulus. And I just remember every Chinese official I talked to about that particular issue, they had the same reaction. Was, what is wrong with you Americans? What is wrong? Anyway, so there's a kind of a bit of a kind of not moving in lockstep, at least as far as our domestic politics are concerned. But I was struck much the way you were, John, in Ray Dalio's approach. I mean, it sounded almost like he was speaking, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I'm just fascinated by it, that almost like he was speaking during the heady days of the 1990s, into the early aughts. And what he was talking about was China very much along a singular trajectory.
Yeah.
And of course, you pointed to one inflection point, which was the global financial crisis. But then the other one has to be economic policy under Xi Jinping writ large. And so I'd love for you just to complicate the picture maybe that Ray laid out on particularly when it comes to this tension between markets and industrial policy, and then after that we'll go to the questions from the audience, because I want to make sure they have time. You have time.
Sure. Yeah, indeed, and I'll make this quick. These problems became evident or the kind of problems I described. Let's call this misallocation of resources. They're sending lots of resources to the inefficient state-owned enterprises, to the municipalities in the short run to boost growth post-crisis, to keep things going, and then recognizing, but they can't go on like this, that we need a fundamental change to get our savings. Put it this way, in China, the rate of investment is about double anybody else in the world, and productivity growth is average. You don't need to know more than that to know that it's not being used very well. So the Long came the 13th five-year plan that was mentioned by the questioner in the Ray Dalio session. And as I'm sure many of us know, we got visits from very high-ranking Chinese officials to explain this meant there was a fundamental shift towards a market-oriented economy, that the market was going to take over and the command economy was going to shrivel. And here we are waiting for the promulgation of the 14th five-year plan, and in between, it looks like the opposite happened, that the state-owned enterprises were given a larger role. It was decided that all private firms of any size had to have a Communist Party representative for uncertain purposes. It's open to discussion. And it looks like they were headed in a completely different direction. And yet, just to make sure nothing's simple, as I said, on the Western side, the typical feeling is, well, one of your problems is you have a financial system that's essentially not very functional, because it's dominated by these big state banks that aren't really banks in the way we know banks. They're banks that have no credit culture. They don't really know how to decide. They have no history of knowing what's a good credit and a bad credit. And therefore, the way you get reform is by opening up to the outside, even though they're very small, but they've done that. So now I think, long-winded answer, sorry, but let's see what the 14th five-year plan says. Does it say, oh, oops, this time we really mean it, a market-oriented economy? Or are they going to say we're headed for a new look socialist market economy, and you'll have to figure out what that means. But you're absolutely right, Andy. We thought especially in 2013, at the promulgation of the 13th five-year plan, we thought, I guess it was promulgated in 14, that we thought the 13th five-year plan meant a big move toward a market economy. It hasn't happened. Let's see if there's a new, where they claim they're headed next spring when that 14th plan is presented.
Yeah, it's going to be really, really interesting to see what happens. Not only what they roll out, but then how they, what actually happens,
Yes.
on the ground and in practice.
One word, forgive me, I can't resist. That's why I look to guys like you, Andy, to explain to naive folks like me. In an authoritarian economy, when they promulgate the plan, it's the official plan, and then it doesn't happen, how's that work?
Yeah, well, we don't have enough time to get into all of that, but that is, that really is in many ways one of the central questions, facing China, just not only in economic policy, but just across the spectrum. But let me give some of our audience an opportunity to ask their questions. So the first one comes from Larissa, and I'm just going to read her question to you, John. Do you think there's any chance the Chinese are facilitating scholarships and studying opportunities for students from all over Africa as a tool to compensate for the decreasing workforce of Chinese nationals to sustain their growth?
Huh. Well, that's an interesting idea. I'd think no. I didn't think China's necessarily been real hospitable to folks that don't look like them. But at the same time, as we know, China has become, it's another area we could talk about, since the global financial crisis, China has become the largest lender to developing countries, and especially in Africa. The economic relationships have blossomed. I remember my surprise. I made one of my first trips as the first deputy managing director of the IMF was to Liberia, where we were trying to engineer debt relief, and to find the presence. And let me tell you, Liberia, God love it, but it is one of the poorest places on the face of the earth. And there were all kinds of Chinese traders and Chinese trading firms that set up business there. So there's a real presence of all kinds in Africa. And of course, our own colleague, Deborah Brodingham, and SAIS program has been one of the early early founts of expertise on this. But so it's a long-winded way of saying, I think what China is trying to facilitate is to reduce the pushback that has come with the notion that China arrives, offers big credits for big public infrastructure, and oh, by the way, that's going to be constructed by a Chinese firm, and oh, by the way, they're going to bring Chinese workers to Africa to build these things, and leave behind the infrastructure and some debt. And so that hasn't worked out as well, anywhere near as well as they'd hoped. And so my guess is part of this, and it's natural, and I think it's positive, that if they're going to have that kind of, they're going to have substantial economic and other relationships, that there ought to be more two-way understanding of the economies and cultures.
Right. No, I think that makes sense. I think that there is anecdotal evidence that you do have workers coming into China, but not far away from Africa, but rather on, countries that either border China or, like places like mainland Southeast Asia. Again, that's relatively, piecemeal.
Yeah, exactly. It's like in Japan, right. Where it's much more extreme.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Okay, thanks, John. So the second question comes from Donald Barnes, and he is asking kind of along the lines of my question, but his is more precise and more pointed, which is, haven't we heard these concerns about loans to underproductive SOEs for many years? Have we been wrong in the past, or is there something different now?
A good question. The answer is yes, but the long answer is yes. But the chickens are coming home to roost in a way. You wouldn't want to look. You don't want to. And certainly don't take me as saying the sky is falling. The sky is falling. Absolutely not. It's if you want to continue the kind of growth rates that the public in China has come to expect, it's not going to be so easy as when the workforce was growing, urbanization was growing, you were taking folks from the countryside where they were essentially hitting a tree with a stick in the immortal image of Mel Brooks, and starting to do things that were really productive. And in other words, it's not as easy. And as I recommend two things. I recommend the World Bank paper on declining productivity, on slowing productivity growth in China, and see the measures, and see that that's basically saying the chickens are coming home to roost. Again, not the end is nigh. It's these problems are now becoming real and are going to have to be dealt with. And the second, forgive me, another ad for that fellow Peter Hessler, who wrote a terrific book called Country Driving, that gives you another people's eye view of the process of economic reform in China. One of them is the process of industrialization / urbanization that is just absolutely fascinating to see that process in its early stages. But that it's slowing down.
Yeah, far be it from me not to also give a plug to Peter Hessler and his.
Sorry, I don't get any of his royalties.
No, and his first book, of course, was Rivertown, about his 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in rural Sichuan, and he writes beautifully, and he has uncomfortable insights that make what you would think is genre reading just completely surprising. So he's also somebody who I would strongly endorse your endorsement. So the next question comes from Lauren Hershey, and her question is about 1/5 the amount of space here as her bio. And so it's wonderful. I'm just gonna, she is an advanced amateur China watcher dating to 1966 through studies, travels, participation with think tanks here in DC, otherwise a former Department of Justice lawyer in the Antitrust Division and Fulbrighter in India, and so on and so on. And she's got a wonderfully open-ended question, which is, what do you see as the opportunities for the new Biden administration in 2021, 2022, with regards to resetting, if you will, or reigniting our relationship with China?
Yeah, boy, that's a $64 question. It's going to be a tough one. That's going to be a tough one because you have to ask. Yeah, we're gonna lower. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Remember at the outset, and even now, let me be blunt. I mean, the criticisms of President Trump and being so buddy with President Xi, he loves autocrats, blah blah blah, and you know, in essence, dear President-elect Biden, don't you do that? Well, we need to get somewhere here. Having done all this effort from the security side that has dramatically endorsed this technological decoupling on security grounds, and the United States government has spent enormous amount of political capital selling that story to our allies. To be honest, I can't envision the new administration walking in and saying, "Oh, just fooling, it's okay, didn't mean it." So this is going to be tough, and that U.S. trade policy, especially toward China, is, in my humble opinion, forgive me, about as fundamentally wrong as it could have been in terms of trying to fix things that everybody knows needed fixing. I was a little, coming back to what Ray Dalio said, I was a little shocked at his look, you know, might makes right. Basically what he said is power determines, forget this rule stuff, forget this principle stuff. Who's the tough one? You know, thought, well, as someone who spent a lot of time at the IMF, who happens to think that a rules-based international system promoted human values and promoted a Pareto superior outcome on many levels, in which might didn't make right. I would hope that we could start making some steps in that direction. And in this regard, to have the U.S. trade representative say, I don't think we should ever do anything multilaterally. We should do everything bilaterally because we're the big guys and we can push everybody around. That doesn't sound like it's a way to win friends and influence people. For the U.S. to say, here's the solution, why those Chinese are going to buy X trillions of bushels of soybeans from us. That's called trade diversion. That says, oh, so our buddies in Brazil, we're telling them, no, don't worry, we're forcing the Chinese to buy from us, and too bad for you. What kind of a system is that? So I think with trade with China, we've got to start over. How you do that in practice, I don't know. I'm not expert enough, but we got to try to get ourselves out of the terrible place we've got ourselves right now. And going all the way back, it wasn't necessarily the best idea, the brightest idea of modern man, but it was a long way from the worst idea, which was the old TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, the idea that one way we're going to install better order and standards in trade in the Asia region is we're going to get all our buddies to agree on a set of standards. And then we get to be able to go to the Chinese and say, actually, if you want to trade with us, you got to play by our rules. And our brilliant 2016 presidential candidates vied in dumping on TPP. And you go, and to replace it with what? With this horrible phase one stupidity, and forgive me, but we need to go back to square one. So among other things, if we're gonna fix things with China, we gotta start with WTO reform, which we have neglected to our shame. Now I'll tell you what I really think, anyway.
Oh, well, you stole my thunder. I was going to say that it's really, really difficult to, I mean, trade diversion is not necessarily a good solution to necessary structural reform within China. It's kind of to a different metaphor from a different president at a different time is akin to nailing Jello to the wall. I should also mention that Lauren is Mr. Lauren Hershey, so I do apologize for I regret the error. We have another question from Jasmine Juarez, who is an undergraduate student studying Sino-Global Relations and an intern at the Mexico-China Chamber of Commerce. And the question is, China's economic rise has created tensions with the U.S. The U.S. has accused China of unfair trade and foreign investment practices. However, China sees its actions as necessary to become more technologically advanced to escape the middle income trap. What are the merits of the respective arguments? I know this is kind of a riff on your answer to the last question, but how can we work towards cooperation? Which you ended your last question by saying, I don't know, and now.
Well, what I meant was there's no simple, in the Washington parlance, there's no silver bullet here. This is going to take, as I was implying, a lot of the complaints come from it's not fair, it's not reciprocal. Okay, so let's try to turn the clock back, or at least get back to, well, let's have a discussion about what we think is fair. And don't we want a set of rules to live by, rather than fair meaning, well, I'll buy, you've got to buy X billions of soybeans from me, and then that's fair? Now, if Mr. Lighthizer was present, he would not only be angry with me, but he would also say, well, wait a minute, the phase one deal included protection of intellectual property and patent and this and that. And there's some truth to it, but the truth is, can't we put this into some kind of a context in which it forms a firm basis for moving forward in a multilateral way, so we avoid these kind of, as best we can, these kind of tit for tat absurdities. And I guess what I'm saying is, if you, another reading, if you will, Mark Wu, W.U., professor at Harvard Law School, has written an excellent article in the Harvard International Law Review, if that's the right title. I think that's the right title. And the title of the article is a 2016 article called "The China Inc. Challenge to the World Trading System," that says explicitly what are the things that needed to be fixed. And the biggest one, of course, and it's not an easy one, is, and the biggest source of our sense of unfairness is, on the one hand, is the the subsidies provided to Chinese export firms, state-owned enterprises. How do we define level playing field? It's not mission impossible. It can be done. But it's not, none of this is simple. And we've spent the last 4 years trying to trash the international system and trash the sense that there are rules, and say this is along the Ray Dalio lines, we're the tough guys and we can impose our will. Hopefully, the new administration will start to move that way, but it's not like there's a groundswell of support. And let me tell you, I've been in some conversations in the last few weeks of folks who have the ear of the folks who I hate to say it, their line is, you ain't gonna get anything out of this politically anytime soon. It's too complicated. No one understands, and you got bigger fish to fry. So, next question.
Well, unfortunately, we have to,
we got to wrap up.
We can start winding down.
No, my answers were too long. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, there is one question left hanging, but luckily she's a part of the SAIS community, so we can always follow up at happy hour. But I think the last image that you left us with that answer is that really, whatever solutions there are, they're going to be inelegant, they're going to be messy, they're not going to be, they're not going to be an easy, they're not going to be easily able to summarize, and they're going to be interlocking, and they're going to be long term. And if we don't do any, if those are things that we're not willing to do, then we're just kicking the can down the road.
Yeah. Allow me to say the following two things. Here, if you want, traditionally, let's end this on an upbeat note, and let's do that, because there are a couple important things, and that is China is filled with really smart people, and out of 1.4 billion, there are some smart ones, and happily, many of them are officials. So the kind of problems I've been talking about are well recognized by key Chinese officials. Folks who need to know are under no illusions that this is the easiest thing going. So they recognize the technicians recognize they need change. Whether that can get done politically is another question. But guess what? Same here, right? We have some problems with our politics, but underneath it, the folks who are technical experts don't see it so differently than what I've been describing. And secondly, President Xi has, when he appears in public in an international stage, says, we are absolute supporters of a rule-based international system. Now, it's one thing to say, oh yeah, but I'd say, isn't that an opportunity? Isn't that an opportunity to try to see if we can, over time, like Andy says, not going to happen instantly, to come to back to an agreement or a process to try to agree on a set of rules. Where that rubber is going to meet the road right now, in an area that you pay attention to, is one of the legacies of the pandemic is going to be a debt crisis in Africa and in Latin America. And as I told you, and you probably already know, since the global financial crisis, China has become the largest single lender to certainly to the developing countries of Africa. And the question is, they need debt restructuring. And here is an opportunity, because heretofore, the Chinese have said, this is our business, not your business. We don't have to tell you about our debt. We don't have to tell you about the terms. And what's happened now, since they're the big guys, when the Western lenders are asked to renegotiate their debt and restructure the debt, the answer is, what about the Chinese? We've got to cooperate on this and do it in what the technical term, pari passu, on equal terms. Let's see if the Chinese are willing to play ball in this arena. And if they are, I would say this is a wonderful opportunity to set a basis for starting to move forward and step by step toward a better relationship in many dimensions, not to say everything's simple. If they are not, then this provides a place to see if the Western powers are willing to say, look, we really mean it. If you really mean it on a rules-based system, we're going to have to come to an agreement. I'm just past time. Thanks very much.
I'm going to ask you if that's your closing statement. I'm going to accept it as your closing statement, because you did end on a positive note, but also one that I think underscores the fact that China is, that we're good at competition in the U.S., as the Chinese are. And that's, generally speaking, neither side should be afraid of it. And but we should also all be working to develop guardrails that we can all live by, within which that can take place.
Exactly.
So I want to thank everybody for attending. This was a lot of fun. As usual, I wish we had more time. John, thank you so much for for really giving us the benefit of your vast experience and your refreshing candor. And as always, I've really enjoyed this. Everybody, please stay safe. And we look forward to being in contact with you again at another such event, another such SAIS event in the very near future. John, good night.
Good night. Thanks so much.
Good night.